Before we begin today's story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy emotional stories that stay with you long after the video ends. My name is Clara Anderson. I'm 40 years old, and until a few months ago, I believed I had a perfect life. From the outside, everything looked flawless: charity events and conversations with successful people. Everyone always told me the same thing: "You're so lucky, Clara." And for a long time, I believed them. But the truth about a marriage isn't what people see at parties or in photographs. The truth lives in the quiet moments: the empty chairs at dinner, the silent hallways late at night, the messages that say, "I'll be home late again." Ethan loved his work. In fact, sometimes I wondered if his work loved him more than I ever could. Emergency surgeries, medical conferences, overnight shifts. Weeks would pass where the only real conversation we had was about schedules and bills. I tried to understand. I told myself this was the price of being married to someone dedicated to saving lives. But slowly, something inside me began to fade. One evening in early April, I was sitting alone in the living room when my phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Ethan. "Emergency surgery. Don't wait for dinner." I stared at the screen for a moment before placing the phone down. That message had become so normal that it no longer surprised me. Still, a small part of me had hoped that tonight might be different. Just as I stood up to turn off the lights, the doorbell suddenly rang. I frowned. Ethan rarely came home early, and he never rang the bell. When I opened the door, I found someone I hadn't seen in years standing there with a travel bag over his shoulder. "Clara," he said with a friendly smile. It was Daniel, Ethan's younger relative who had just returned to the city after finishing his studies on the West Coast. "Daniel," I said in surprise, "I thought you were still in California." "Just got back today," he replied with a laugh. "New York already feels louder than I remember." I stepped aside to let him in. The quiet apartment suddenly felt less empty. Daniel had always carried an easy energy with him, relaxed, curious, and full of stories about the places he had visited. Within minutes, the living room that had been silent all evening was filled with conversation again. But Daniel's arrival was only the beginning, because later that night, another unexpected visitor would walk through that same door, and none of us realized that this simple evening would become the moment that quietly changed my life forever. The door opened again later that evening, and in walked someone I hadn't expected: Alex, Ethan's longtime friend. He looked just as I remembered: tall, easygoing, and with a smile that could light up any room. "Clara, I didn't know you'd be here tonight," he said, dropping his bag onto the couch. "I wasn't expecting you either," I replied, smiling despite myself. Soon, the three of us were sitting around the coffee table, drinking tea and sharing stories. Daniel spoke about his travels across the West Coast, the small towns he had fallen in love with, and the people he had met. Alex told funny tales from college days with Ethan, moments I had never witnessed, memories I didn't even know existed. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: alive. The quiet apartment no longer felt cold and empty. There was laughter, conversation, and the warm sense of connection that I had been missing for so long. At one point, Daniel looked at me and asked gently, "Have you thought about going back to your writing?" I froze. Writing had been my first love, the thing that once made me feel powerful and seen. But after years of focusing on being the perfect wife to Ethan, I had stopped. I I don't know if I can," I admitted softly. "It's been so long, maybe I've forgotten how." Alex smiled, leaning back. "You haven't forgotten, you've just been waiting for the right moment. Maybe tonight is the start of something new." I laughed lightly, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in years. It felt fragile, yet full of hope. For the rest of the evening, we talked about life, dreams, and the choices that had led us here. By the time the night drew to a close, the city outside was quiet, but inside, I felt awake in a way I hadn't in years. I realized something important that night: life could still surprise me. It wasn't too late to find joy, to explore old passions, and to reconnect with the world outside my apartment walls. And as Daniel and Alex said their goodbyes and walked out, I knew that things were different now. This was the night that would quietly start to change everything in my life, but I had no idea just how much it would unfold in the days to come. The next morning, the apartment felt different. The sun poured through the large windows, casting golden light over the familiar furniture, but everything seemed new. I found myself lingering over my morning coffee, thinking about the night before. Daniel's laughter, Alex's stories, the warmth of their presence. It all lingered in my mind like a melody I couldn't forget. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. Running late, don't wait for me, big surgery today. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of frustration and relief. Relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore, that I could focus on myself just for today. I took a deep breath and decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I opened my old laptop and stared at the blank page, waiting for my fingers to move. And they did, slowly at first, then with more confidence. Words flowed, memories came alive, and a part of me that had been silent for so long started to speak again. Hours passed without me noticing. The city outside bustled as usual, but inside, I was in my own world, my old world. Later that afternoon, there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't Daniel or Alex. It was a colleague from my old writing days, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Clara, I heard you were back in New York. I have a project I think you'd be perfect for. Are you interested?" My heart raced. An opportunity to return to writing, to reclaim a part of my identity I had almost forgotten. And it came just when I needed it most. I realized then that last night wasn't just a random reunion. It had been a spark, a moment that reminded me of who I was, what I loved, and what I could still become. For the first time in years, I felt like my life was truly my own again. But even as hope and excitement filled me, a quiet thought lingered in the back of my mind. Could I really embrace this new chapter without facing the emptiness that had built up over so many years? And if I did, what would it mean for the life I thought I had carefully built with Ethan? The answers weren't clear yet, but one thing was certain. My story was just beginning, and nothing would ever feel the same again. Days passed, and I continued to write. Each page I typed brought back a part of myself I thought I had lost forever. Daniel and Alex remained in touch, checking in and sharing small stories that made me laugh, reminding me that life could still be full of joy. One evening, as I looked out at the Manhattan skyline, I realized something important. The life I had once thought perfect, lavish dinners, social events, a respected husband, wasn't enough for me anymore. I needed meaning. I needed passion. I needed to be seen not just as someone's wife, but as Clara, a woman with her own voice and dreams. When Ethan came home that night, I felt a calmness I hadn't felt in years. We talked quietly over dinner about schedules, about small things, and for the first time, I felt like an equal in our conversation, not because everything was perfect, but because I had found myself again. Later, Daniel dropped by with his usual friendly grin. "You look different," he said, smiling. "I feel different," I admitted, like I've been asleep for years and I finally woke up. Alex called from across town, laughing at some story, and I realized that life had room for laughter again. Real laughter, not just polite smiles at social events. That night, as I closed my laptop, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never let life pass me by again. I didn't know exactly what the future held. I didn't know how every choice I would make from here on would shape my path. But one thing was certain. I was no longer waiting for someone else to define my happiness. My story wasn't about perfection or appearances anymore. It was about me reclaiming my life, my voice, and my dreams. And as the city lights twinkled outside my window, I finally felt at peace, ready to embrace whatever came next.